I did not slam the door. I did not raise my voice across that long oak table, though every muscle in my body wanted to. I set my wineglass down slow and quiet, on the linen my granddaughter had ironed that afternoon, and I looked at the man who had just told a room full of people that my daughter wasn't smart enough to handle her own money. His name doesn't matter much anymore. I'll call him what he was to me then. My son-in-law, the husband of my only child, the father of the 2 children sleeping upstairs. He said it with a little laugh, the kind men use when they want cruelty to sound like affection. "She means well," he said, swirling his bourbon, "but you know how she is with numbers." I had to take her card away, for her own good. And then his mother, sitting at the end of the table in her pearls, smiled into her plate and said, "Some girls just never learn to be responsible. It's a kindness, really, what you do for her." It was Thanksgiving. 43 years I had hosted that dinner, and that year I had handed the reins to my daughter because she'd asked, because she wanted to host it in the house she and her husband had bought out in the Connecticut suburbs, the one with the big windows and the kitchen she'd been so proud of. I drove up from the city with 2 pies and a heart full of pride. I left that night with something else entirely. Let me back up. My daughter was the first in our family to go to college. I raised her on a court reporter's salary in a 2-bedroom apartment in Hartford after her father left when she was 6 and never looked back. I typed every word spoken in that courthouse for 31 years. I know the sound of a lie better than most people know their own children. I heard men in expensive suits explain why they hadn't really hit their wives, why the bruises were from falling, why the money had simply vanished. I sat 10 feet from them and recorded every syllable, and I learned the grammar of control the way other women learn recipes. So when my daughter brought him home 8 years ago, I felt something cold settle in my stomach before he'd even finished shaking my hand. He was charming. That was the first warning. He held doors and remembered my birthday and complimented the curtains, and he watched her the whole time, the way a man watches a thing he intends to keep. When she laughed too loud at her own joke, his hand found her knee under the table, and she went quiet. I saw it. She didn't. I said nothing then. That's the part I carry. I said nothing because she was 31 and glowing and certain, and because every mother knows that the surest way to push a daughter into a man's arms is to tell her he's wrong for her. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself 31 years in a courtroom had made me see monsters in ordinary men. I went home and I prayed I was wrong. For the first 2 years it was small. He didn't like her friends, so the friends fell away one by one, and she explained each departure with a reason that sounded almost true. He thought she worked too much, so she stepped back from the marketing firm where she'd been on track to make partner, and she called it a choice. He preferred her hair long, so she stopped cutting it. None of it was a crime. That's the thing nobody understands until they've watched it happen to someone they love. None of it is ever a crime. It's 1,000 small surrenders, each one reasonable on its own, and one day you look up and the woman you raised. To be loud and certain is checking a man's face before she speaks. The money came later. He convinced her to put her savings into a joint account for the family, and then he became the one who managed it, paid the bills, gave her what she needed. She had to ask him for grocery money. She, who had once negotiated a 6-figure contract before she was 30, had to text her husband to ask if she could buy our grandson new sneakers. And when she told me this, she told it like it was sweet, like he took care of everything, so she didn't have to worry. I smiled and I held my coffee cup and I felt the floor tilt under me. I started watching more carefully after that. I noticed she'd stopped wearing the bracelet I gave her for her 40th, the one with the little blue stone. I noticed she flinched when her phone buzzed. I noticed a yellow-green shadow on her wrist one afternoon in August, and when I asked, she said the dog had pulled her too hard on the leash. They didn't have a dog, but it was Thanksgiving that broke it open. It was him saying she was too stupid to manage money in front of his mother and his brother and my own grandchildren, and it was that little laugh, and it was my daughter, 45 years old, A grown woman, my brilliant girl, looking down at her plate and saying nothing, apologizing for nothing, folding herself smaller right there at her own table. I put my glass down. I stood up. I said I needed to use the restroom, and I walked down the hall past the family photos, and I locked the door, and I sat on the edge of the tub with my hands shaking, and I made one phone call. Here is the thing my son-in-law did not know. Here is the thing my son-in-law did not know. Here is the thing his mother in her pearls did not know. I did not stay a court reporter all those years. When my daughter was in high school, I started taking night classes. Paralegal certification first, then more. It took me 11 years, working full days in that courthouse and studying until 2 in the morning, but I passed the bar at 54. I never made a show of it. I never needed to. For the last decade before I retired, I had worked in the office of the state's attorney, and the people I knew were not the kind of people who lost cases. The woman I called that night from my daughter's bathroom had prosecuted financial abuse and domestic coercion for 20 years. She was the best I ever saw. She was also my closest friend. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did. Quietly on the edge of that tub, with the sound of laughter coming through the door, I told her about the joint account and the canceled credit card and the friends who disappeared and the bruise that came from a dog they didn't own. She listened the way only she could. Then she asked me 3 questions, and I answered them, and she said, "Get the documents. Get the bank statements, the text where he controls the money, anything you can photograph without him knowing. Don't confront him, don't tip him off, get her somewhere safe first, then we move. Coercive control is hard to prove, but financial abuse leaves a paper trail, and a paper trail is something I can build a wall out of." I came back to the table. I smiled. I complimented the turkey. I asked his mother about her bridge club. I am 67 years old, and I have spent my whole life learning to keep my face still while my heart does something else, and that night I used every bit of it. It took 11 days. I asked my daughter to spend a weekend with me in the city, just us, said I was lonely since retirement, which wasn't a lie. She came. And on the second night, in my little apartment with the radiator clanking the way it had her whole childhood, I told her what I'd seen. Not all at once. I started by asking her to tell me about her day. Really tell me. And somewhere in the middle of it, she started to cry. And then it came out of her like a dam breaking. 8 years of it. The things he said when no one was around. The way he tracked her location. The night he'd taken her car keys so she couldn't leave during an argument and made her stand in the kitchen until 3 in the morning while he listed everything wrong with her. The time he'd grabbed her arm so hard the marks lasted a week. I held my daughter on my couch the way I had when she was small, and I did not say "I told you so," because that is the cruelest thing a mother can say, and because she already knew, and because none of this was her fault. I want to be clear about that. None of it was ever her fault. The shame belonged entirely to him. "I have a friend," I told her. "She's a lawyer. She's the best there is. And she already knows your name, and she is already on your side, and you are not going back into that house unless you decide to. Not tonight. Not ever if you don't want to." She was so afraid. She talked about the kids, about money, about where she'd go, about what people would say, and I answered every fear with a plan, because by then my friend and I had already built one. There was a place for her and the children. There was a way to move the money. There was an order we could file that would mean he could not come near her. I had spent 11 days while smiling at his Thanksgiving table, making sure that when my daughter was ready, the path would already be cleared. She was ready. We moved on a Tuesday morning while he was at work. My friend had the protective order ready to file. We had photographed every bank statement, every controlling text, every transfer. We had the medical record from the time she'd gone to urgent care for her wrist and lied about the cause. But the nurse had written down what she suspected, the way good nurses do, and that note was gold. We had a forensic accountant ready to trace where her money had gone. By the time he came home to an empty house that night, my daughter and my grandchildren were safe 40 miles away, and there was a sheriff's deputy who had already served him papers at his office. He called me, of course. He always thought I was the soft one, the doting grandmother who brought pies. He called me sweet at first, confused, then wounded, then furious, then sweet again. He said I'd manufactured a misunderstanding. He said his wife was unstable. He said I'd regret this, that I had no idea what I was dealing with. And I said the only words I said to him in that entire ordeal, and I said them calmly, because by then, calm was a weapon I had spent a lifetime sharpening. I spent 31 years writing down what men like you say in courtrooms, I told him, and I spent 13 more learning how to put them there. You called my daughter stupid in front of her children. Let's see how smart you are when it's your turn to explain yourself under oath. Then I hung up. The divorce took 14 months. He fought it the way these men always do, with expensive lawyers and outraged dignity, and a story about how he was the real victim. But financial abuse leaves a paper trail, just like my friend said, and that trail led to a second account he'd hidden, money he'd siphoned from my daughter's inheritance from her grandmother, a sum he told her was lost in a bad investment. It wasn't lost. It was in his name, in a bank 2 towns over. When that came out, his outraged dignity went very quiet. My daughter got the house. She got primary custody. She got every dollar he'd hidden, plus the cost of the proceedings, because the judge, a woman about my age who had seen 100 men exactly like him, did not care for the way he spoke about the mother of his children even there, even in her courtroom, even when it was clearly costing him. Some men cannot help showing you who they are. He showed her, and she made him pay for it. His mother never apologized. The last I heard, she tells people her son was driven off by a vindictive ex-wife and her interfering mother. Let her. I sleep fine. What I think about on the nights I think about it at all is not him. It's my daughter the first morning in the new apartment, standing in the kitchen in her robe, holding a cup of coffee she had bought with her own money from her own account. And the look on her face when she realized no one was going to ask her where she'd been, or what she'd spent, or why she'd laughed. She stood there for a long moment. Then she started to cry, but it was a different kind of crying, the kind that comes when a fist you didn't know you were clenching finally opens. She went back to work. She made partner 2 years later, the thing she'd given up at 31, and she called me from her new office with a window, and she could barely talk through the laughing. My grandchildren are teenagers now. They are loud and certain, and they argue with their mother about curfews and music and politics, and every time I hear them talk back to her without fear, I think, that is what we saved. I want to tell you something, because I know who watches stories like mine. I know some of you are sitting very still right now because something I described sounds like your kitchen, your phone, your wrist. I am not a doctor, and I am not your lawyer, and I cannot reach through this screen. But I can tell you what I learned across 44 years of listening to the worst of what people do to each other. It is never one big thing. It is 1,000 small surrenders, and you are not weak or stupid for not seeing it sooner, because it is designed not to be seen. The shame is not yours. The fault is not yours, and the people who love you are not as far away as he has convinced you they are. If you can, write it down, the dates, the things that were said, the amounts of money, the moments that frightened you. Keep it somewhere he cannot find it. Tell one person you trust. Not because you have decided to leave. You don't have to decide anything today, but because a written record is a door, and someday you may want to walk through it, and it is so much easier to walk through a door that is already standing open. My daughter is the strongest woman I know. She always was. He just spent 8 years telling her otherwise, and for a while she believed him, the way the kindest people often do. I put my wine glass down at that Thanksgiving table and I made one phone call. That's all it looked like, from the outside. A grandmother excusing herself from dinner. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but then again, neither did she. Not until she remembered. And watching her remember was the great privilege of my life. I have thought a great deal about why it took 8 years, and the answer is not the one I expected. It was not that my daughter was weak. She was never weak. It was that cruelty came to her disguised as care, and care is the one thing a kind person never thinks to defend against. He took her card and called it protection. His mother smiled and called it kindness. The trap worked precisely because it wore the face of love, and the people most vulnerable to that trap are not the foolish ones. They are the trusting ones, the generous ones, the ones who assume the best, because that is what they themselves would offer. So if there is anything I would hand to you, it is this. Stay decent, but do not confuse decency with surrender. I held my tongue for years because I thought silence was kindness, and I was wrong. Real goodness is not the absence of conflict. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to look away from what is happening right in front of you, even at your own dinner table, even when speaking up will cost you peace, and learn to see clearly. I spent 31 years listening to people lie under oath, and the most important thing it taught me was that the truth usually leaves a trail. He told my daughter her inheritance was lost. It was not lost. It was sitting in an account 2 towns over with his name on it. Feelings can be argued with forever, but a bank statement cannot. When something feels wrong, do not only ask how you feel about it, ask what you can document, what you can verify, what would still be true if no one believed you. That habit of patient, honest looking is what turned a vague unease into a wall he could not climb over. But seeing clearly and meaning well are not enough on their own, and this is the part people forget. I knew something was wrong for years before I did anything, and knowing changed nothing until I acted. What finally freed my daughter was not insight. It was 11 days of keeping my face calm while my hands shook, of photographing statements when no one was watching, of doing the slow, frightening, unglamorous work after the moment of clarity had passed. Resolve is not a feeling that arrives. It is a decision you make again every morning, especially on the mornings you are afraid. My daughter has all 3 of these now. She is still the kindest person I know, but she no longer mistakes kindness for keeping quiet. She watches the world with clear eyes and asks for proof. And when she decides something, she follows it all the way through. He spent 8 years telling her she was stupid, and she became, in the end, the most clear-headed and courageous woman I have ever raised. That is the only revenge that ever raised. That is the only revenge that ever mattered to me. Not that he lost, that she remembered exactly who she was.